also maybe, and we can switch it off and do
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I think this is easier than using the mic because, okay. Huh? I wish. So, okay. Without further ado, I'll do a talk. I'm very glad that so many of you could make it today despite all the more important things that are going on, including our country falling apart. And as Shamim said, there was 3 protests going on today. So thank you for being here. I'm honored. I really am. This is probably the first time I'm giving a talk at JNU, so I really am honored. So without further ado, there'll be a lot of slides, so keep switching back and forth. That's interesting. Usually the slides are behind you, so you'll have to, I don't know, how should we do this? There are a lot of slides, so you might have to keep changing your attention. Let's see, if it gets a little too much, we can figure out another way of doing this.
It's okay, we are used to this.
Okay, all right. The table tennis, the TT of attention, right? Yeah. What does it mean to live in cities? When we think of cities in Asia, we think of the skyscraper and the slum. One is the location of the new elite workforce connected to globalized networks of capital through startups and call centers. The other, the informal, chaotic, and often violent world of those left out of the global flows of wealth and information, wanting desperately to break in. The world depicted, for example, in Arvind Adiga's White Tiger. In either case, the time of the city is oriented towards velocity, towards the promises of the future, and getting there faster. But there are other temporalities of city life and other aesthetics of city form. In Delhi, it is the ruins of the pre-colonial past that anchor other relations to temporality and other visions of urban life. My talk today is focused on Firoz Shah Kotla, a ruined medieval palace which has become a dargah or Muslim saint shrine in contemporary Delhi. Built circa 1354 by Sultan Firoz Shah Tughlaq and long fallen into disrepair, the widespread popularity of Firoz Shah Kotla as a dargah began in 1977. Firoz Shah Kotla is frequented in increasing numbers by both Hindus and Muslims, and the saints venerated at this dargah are not human by most accounts, but long-lived spirits known as Jinn or genies. Visitors write letters of petition to these Jinn saints as if petitioning a government official, including their name, address, and passport photos in their appeals. They deposit multiple copies of these letters before makeshift altars in several chambers within these ruins, like up there. Firoz Shah Kotla is also a place where animal life flourishes, especially cats, snakes, and kites. As the jinn are shapeshifters in Islamic cosmology, often taking the form of animals, these animals are also imbued with sacrality in the space. There are no institutional religious figures at Firoz Shah Kotla. This is a historical monument under the custody of the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI. It is an unusually democratic religious space characterized by freewheeling theological conversations, DIY, do-it-yourself rituals, and increasingly selfies. I know that's not a selfie, but you get the idea. Why is this space important? As I argue in my book, Genealogy, Time, Islam, and Ecological Thought in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi, the enchanted nature of popular Islam that we encounter here is not a pre-modern relic, but an ethical, political, and theological stance emerging anew in response to the conditions of post-colonial urban life. What does it mean to live in a city of jinns, as one popular descriptor of Delhi goes? One afternoon at Firoz Shah Kotla, I had a conversation with one of the staff members of the ASI who worked there as a caretaker. The ASI employee, who has been posted on duty to many of Delhi's medieval monuments, about 170 of which are protected in the custody of the ASI, told me that in all the old monuments of Delhi, not just here, but sare kilo mein, in all the forts, there are buzurgon ke saye, the shades of Muslim holy men. You see them not just at night but also in the day, often dressed in white clothes and with white turbans, the traditional attire of Muslim religious figures. But, he said, if you don't disrespect them, there is no harm to anyone. ASI officials are happy and prosperous and in no trouble with the courts or the police, and that is a big thing these days. The Buzurg bless those who serve at the forts. In the account of the ASI employee, all these pre-colonial fortifications, now under the jurisdiction of the secular ASI, are haunted by the images, by the presence of Muslim holy figures, a presence that is a blessing for those lucky enough to live or work within medieval walls. A blessing that saves you from getting entangled with the police and judiciary of the post-colonial state. This conversation happened in the year 2010, the year that Delhi hosted the Commonwealth Games. The years leading up to the Commonwealth Games in Delhi had seen a sustained campaign to turn it, in the words of the Times of India slogan, from walled city to world city. The walled city in the slogan refers to Old Delhi, the dense commercial, manufacturing and residential hub just to the north of Firozshah Kotla, originally built in the Mughal era. The idea of the world city as it applies to Delhi, as Asher Gertner points out, is primarily an aesthetic idea, an idea tied to a futuristic vision of the city associated with the steel and glass architecture of shopping malls and metro stations. In the years leading up to the Commonwealth Games and beyond, this futuristic aesthetic of a world-class city has led to a profound remaking of the city's landscapes and the displacement of over a million slum dwellers whose dwellings did not fit into this aesthetic. But the medieval ruins of Delhi, scattered throughout the city, hold open another entirely different aesthetic, the aesthetic of the pre-colonial Islamic city. And analogous to the ways in which the 20th century surrealists found revolutionary potential in the outmoded architecture of the 19th century Parisian arcades, for the marginalized people of Delhi, these ruins serve as spaces for both a critique of the present and the radical potential for things to be otherwise than they are. I read the image of the saints haunting the ruins of medieval Delhi as a dialectical image. And like Walter Benjamin's idea of dialectical image, in which the coming together of what has been with the now has an emancipatory impulse, religious practices and the religious imagination at Firozshah Kotla contest the empty homogeneous time desired by the post-colonial Indian state, holding open other experiences of time and other possibilities of memory in the life of the contemporary city. Here, the past exists as a field of potential, what could have been and could be again, which destabilizes the inevitability of present states of affairs. Firozshah Kotla is a space where relations between the state and its citizens, between Hindus and Muslims, and between men and women are radically reimagined, as are the relations between animals and humans. Firozshah Kotla offers us a new way to think about a question of global import at a time when cities are being reshaped globally by dispossession, the withdrawal of social services, and the unpredictable effects of rapid climate change. The question of how dwelling is to be remade in a space of devastation. Archival amnesia, as I titled the first section. The beginnings of post-colonial urban life in Delhi are deeply tied to the violence and mass displacements of the partition of India, the legacies of which continue to reshape the urban fabric of and urban experience in Delhi. The violence, which began almost immediately after the formal declaration of independence, saw a massive demographic shift in Delhi, with much of the city's Muslim population leaving and a huge influx of Hindu and Sikh refugees coming in from West Punjab, doubling the city's population almost overnight. As Wazira Zamindar's work shows, the partition of the subcontinent was not a singular event restricted to 1947, but rather the inauguration of a structure of dispossession, displacement, and amnesia. The long partition, to use Zamindar's phrase, continued to affect the Muslims of Delhi long after the events of 1947, being entrenched in the laws and policies of the post-colonial state, systematically eroding Muslim rights of property and citizenship. In the years after 1947, medieval mosques and shrines under the custody of the ASI were obsessively patrolled and protected, much more so than in the colonial era, and no religious practice was allowed in them. They were now rendered dead in the parlance of the ASI, and all efforts were made to prevent these buildings, now referred to by the generic monuments, from returning to life, which is to say, to religious practice. This was part of the contradictory nature of post-partition India, an ostensibly secular country, but one in which public life was now dominated by Hindu self-assertion and the ever-present threat of Hindu right-wing violence. The identification of the ruinscape of Delhi with Muslim life worlds made it impossible for them to remain as living spaces in the new dispensation. The monuments had to be preserved as part of the built heritage of the secular nation-state, scenic backdrops to the progress of the nation, but were increasingly removed from the realm of everyday life and religiosity. The policies and laws of the post-colonial state became necrophiliac with respect to the monuments of the Muslim past, able to love and care for them only as corpses divested of life. Naseem Changezi, 100 years old when I first interviewed him in 2010, he passed away earlier this year, a man who presented himself as the memory keeper of Old Delhi, embodies the effects of partition on the landscapes of Muslim memory. He was in a strange mood for one of our interviews, and his constant refrain that day was, "Ab kaun batayega?" Who will tell you now? This refrain kept punctuating his rambling narratives which mostly dealt with the post-colonial transformation of Delhi and partition violence. Naseem Changezi told me a story of his uniqueness, of his indispensability in a city where memory has died. It was 4 or 5 years ago, he said, when the cricket ground just to the north of Firozshah Kotla was being renovated, and in the course of the renovation they tried to cover over an old grave near one of the gates. 10,000 people from the old city attended a massive protest against the effacement of the grave. In the meeting that followed with the government, the local MLA called upon Naseem Changezi to tell them of the importance of the grave and the necessity of not destroying it. According to Naseem Changezi, he told them what he knew, that the grave was that of Amir Panjakash, the great calligrapher of Mughal Delhi. The grave was left undisturbed. Oral testimony was needed to preserve the grave of a calligrapher, a man who produced documents for a living. Why did a then 95-year-old man have to be dragged out into this dispute to give oral testimony about the grave of a well-known calligrapher? Surely there were documents. Where were the documents? The absence of documents in the story of an attempt to save a Muslim grave from effacement tells us something about the relation of the post-colonial Indian state to the Islamic landscapes of the capital it inherited. Haunted by the anti-Muslim violence of partition, the state wished to forget all Muslim presence. My own experience of accessing and reading the records of the archaeological survey is illustrative. First, I was denied access. Then, when through networks of friendship and patronage, as these things usually work, I got access to the archaeological survey's record room, I discovered that the records were in deep and dusty disarray, moth-eaten and uncared for. This is an image that I'm sure a lot of you who do archival research have seen. And the files themselves illustrated a culture not of authorized memory, but of authorized forgetting. For example, in 1977, a certain Sayyid Ali Wajid wrote a letter to the ASI complaining that the staff of the ASI was interfering with people's veneration at Firozshah Kotla, which he claimed had been going on for more than a century. The officials of the ASI, instead of investigating the actions of their employees, launched an inquiry into the veracity of the claims of veneration made by the complainant. The dominant tone of the file is surprise and annoyance, caught completely unawares by the seemingly sudden eruption of religious practice at Firozshah Kotla on their watch. The surprise is not altogether misplaced because oral accounts also remember the popularity of Firozshah Kotla increasing dramatically after 1977. What was remarkable to me in reading the file was that in the course of their investigation, the officials of the ASI never once took recourse to their own records, relying instead on various oral accounts and published sources outside the institutional archive and its system of files. But in the Chief Commissioner's Office records, records of the colonial government, which are right here in the Delhi State Archives, there are copies of a detailed series of exchanges with the colonial ASI relating to Firoz Shah Kotla, when, under its jurisdiction, renovation and excavation began there in 1914, which revealed not only that there was a steady trickle of people constantly passing through Firoz Shah Kotla, but also that practices of veneration, like sticking coins to the wall, that are seen today were also seen back then. But as file 2470/76/77 MT/ASI in the Archaeological Survey's record room reveals, no one in the ASI bothered to look at the files in their own record room, where a duplicate file of this correspondence surely exists or once existed. Another striking case is that of Sultan Ghari, which is in Vasant Kunj, which many of you may have seen in passing. Sultan Ghari is the venerated tomb of Sultan Iltutmish's eldest son, and it is the oldest Muslim tomb within the current boundaries of India, dating to the early 13th century. Records of its veneration go back at least as far as the mid-18th century. The tomb was vandalized in 1947. Several years after this destruction, in 1955, the Jamiat Ulema-e-Hind, an organization of Muslim religious leaders, wrote to the Ministry of Education, which was the ministry that at that point controlled the ASI, wanting to get the tomb of Sultan Ghari repaired and renovated in time for the upcoming Urs, or anniversary of the saint. Following orders from the ministry, the ASI promptly repaired the tomb. However, in the note they sent back to the ministry, it was observed, it is noted that an Urs is going to be held at the monument from the 16th to the 18th of July, 1955. The monument has been a dead and deserted one for a long time, and no Urs has been held in the past. There is therefore no justification for the use of the monument for such purposes. The text is up there. In looking at the evidence available, archaeologists seem to have pointedly ignored the report on Sultan Ghari published in the Journal of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1947, which is the next text below, which clearly states, his tomb is even now regarded as sacred by the Muslims, and every year on the 17th day of the month of Ziqad, his Urs or anniversary is celebrated, and the shrine is thronged with pilgrims. How did the 8 years between 1947 and 1955 become the long time in which the monument had been a dead and deserted one? What made it impossible for the ASI to acknowledge or remember the usage of medieval monuments as living spaces of worship and veneration? Partition violence saw the destruction of scores of Muslim shrines and tombs in Delhi, erasing a shared sacred geography virtually overnight. The post-partition, post-colonial Indian state, haunted by the specter of Hindu right-wing violence, operates in a mode of archival amnesia, actively working to forget all ways of being, all claims to belonging, all landscapes and property claims which preceded its inception in 1947. The state makes the papers, the only form it considers to be of evidentiary worth, vanish within the archive, hidden by dust and entropy, destroyed by insects and neglect. The archival amnesia of the state produces the post-colonial time of the government, a form of secularized messianic time, in that it is the time of the radical abolition of tradition and history. In this new temporality of the nation state, Muslim time was firmly in the past, the once upon a time of fairy tales. Muslims had no claims to the present or to presence in the homogeneous time and space of the new nation state. In contrast to official ideologies and practices, in the stories told at Firoz Shah Kotla and in other parts of Delhi, Jinns are linked to deep time, connecting human figures thousands of years apart. In these stories, long-lived Jinns serve as interlocutors connecting figures as distant in time as Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, or in a story directly linked to Firoz Shah Kotla, the Prophet Muhammad and the famed theologian Shah Waliullah of 18th century Delhi. In these stories, Jinns are the figures of the transmission of memory beyond all possibility of human history. These stories became increasingly popular in post-partition Delhi, as did the public veneration of Jinn saints at Firozshah Kotla. The popularity of Jinns and their links to deep time increased in a city whose landscapes, public life, and archives were increasingly marked by the deliberate forgetting of a past, the pre-1947 city, barely a generation old. The Jinns are figures, we could say, of apotropaic mnemonics, magical figures of memory who serve as an antidote to the magical amnesia, the sleight of hand of the post-colonial state. The ritual forms and other embodied practices of people at Firozshah Kotla also create a constellation, a dialectical tension between the 14th century city and the time of the now. We know from the account of the medieval traveler Ibn Battuta that on 2 days a week, the 14th century Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq used to sit personally for an-nazar fil mazalim, or the consideration of injustices, in a large open hall. In this, he seems to have been following the exhortations of the 11th century Persian scholar and statesman Nizam al-Mulk Tusi, who wrote in his Siyasatnama, or Book of Government, "It is absolutely necessary that on 2 days in the week, the king should sit for the redress of wrongs, to give justice, and listen to the words of his subjects with his own ears. It is fitting that some written petition should also be submitted, and he should give a ruling on each one." This legal form of direct access and complaint to the king was known as the shikwa, a word that still carries the connotation of grievance or complaint in modern Hindi and Urdu. So, for example, Allama Iqbal's famous shikwa. The idea of direct access to the sovereign, emphasized in pre-colonial political theory and practice, is very different from most people's contemporary access to the government through mediating layers of bureaucracy. Both popular memory and archival records agree that popular religious practice returned to Firozshah Kotla in 1977, in the months after the end of the emergency, a nearly 2-year period of the suspension of electoral democracy and the rule of law. Many of those who come to Firozshah Kotla, both Hindu and Muslim, are from the areas worst affected by the excesses of the emergency. The working class Muslim and Dalit neighborhoods of Old Delhi, targeted by the post-colonial state for evictions, forced sterilizations, and demolitions. They write their petitions to the Jinn saints among these Tughlaq ruins in a form reminiscent of the shikwa, prominent in the political theory of the Delhi Sultanate. To find petitions that are strangely resonant of a medieval legal form being deposited in the ruins of a 14th century Tughlaq palace is striking. The letters are often photocopied, as if when applying to a government office. Multiple photocopies of the same letter can be found in various niches and alcoves all over the ruins, as if they are applications sent to the different departments of a modern bureaucracy. The 14th century comes together with the 21st in the ruins of a medieval space of sovereignty, as people walk through thick masonry walls and high arched passageways, which are already otherworldly, indexing another way of being than that afforded by the cramped, boxy architecture of most of contemporary Delhi. In Ritual and its Consequences, Seligman et al. Argue that ritual is subjunctive, imagining and ordering the world as if, in opposition to the way its practitioners know the real world to be. Ritual performs the way the world could be, the way the world should be, as opposed to what it is. Why is it that the as if of emergent ritual in Delhi invokes the past rather than the future? At Firozshah Kotla, stories are told of Jinn eyewitnesses who remember events and people from centuries ago, long-lived eyewitnesses of the otherwise unrecallable past. These figures point us to a radically different relation to the past than that allowed by current historiography. Here the past appears not just as what was, but as what could have been and could be again. The past not as past and dead, but as full of concepts and potentialities for life, for the present and the future. Which brings me to intimate sovereignty. In the ruins of a medieval palace, a man deposits a petition. Sarkar, I am unemployed and I cannot find work anywhere, and if I find work somewhere, he doesn't give me money and troubles me instead. Sarkar, I pray to you to turn your generous gaze on me and get rid of my troubles. The term he uses to address the saint, Sarkar or Lord, is the same term that is used to speak of government, as in Bharat Sarkar, the government of India. In a time when the post-colonial government's relation to its poorer subjects is mediated by layers of bureaucracy and characterized by a plenitude of hostility and a scarcity of care, the religious act of petitioning a Jinn saint in the ruins of a sultan's palace is also political, reimagining the subject's relation to the state. The letters written to the Jinn saints enact an intimate sovereignty, a paternalistic government whose justice reaches far beyond the categories of care imposed by the post-colonial government on its subject populations. Chatterjee argues that in political society, collectives organize themselves into populations, categories of subject whose biological care is the goal of colonial and post-colonial governmentality, and thus turn the logic of governmental classification and enumeration into a moral imperative for care. The letters written at Firoz Shah Kotla, by contrast, imagine a far more intimate and individualized relation to sovereignty in ways which actively critique and pose an alternative to people's relation to the contemporary government. For example, in the ruins of Firoz Shah Kotla, a woman deposits a petition. There is a policeman who has been troubling my husband. May he leave Seelampur forever. May he be transferred somewhere else. May Allah grant my husband relief from these policemen. You are a saint and a lover of Allah. Please make all our troubles end. The letters written to the Jinn saints also create an unusual archive of the struggles and desires of subaltern life in the contemporary city, hence this section on archives of urban desire. Voices otherwise unheard by families, by the media, by the government. It is a unique autobiographical archive, especially of women's voices in the contemporary city. By photographing some of these letters in situ over the years, I have preserved a tiny fragment of this transitory archive of letters written to the saints. For at irregular intervals, these letters are taken down, swept into piles by the workers of the ASI and burnt. These letters are also important because they give us an altogether different vision of religion and its relation to modern urban life and desire than common sense would have us expect. In the letters deposited and the stories told at Firoz Shah Kotla, we see the imagination of a justice which allows for an undoing of the often oppressive norms of family and community and allows women and men to make ethical choices which contradict societal morality. Here we see a space of religion holding open the space for transgressing communal morality and the articulation of an ethical stance which does much more justice to urban life, where people encounter and form intimacies with people across the boundaries of class and religion all the time. I wonder what the Hindu right, with its rhetoric of love jihad, not that you guys need to see more examples, I wonder what the Hindu right, with its rhetoric of love jihad and its anxieties about maintaining patriarchal control over female bodies and reproduction, will make of the letters written at Firoz Shah Kotla, in which time and time again the wishes made by women go against the moralities of family and community, wishing to marry across lines of caste and religion, desiring independent marital homes away from the normative domain of the multi-generational joint family, also known as the Hindu undivided family, sometimes even begging the saint to get divorces from their husbands. I also found remarkable continuities between contemporary practices and desires expressed at Firoz Shah Kotla and the popular veneration of Muslim Jinn saints going back to at least the 18th century. Pre-colonial Urdu Rekhti poetry, a genre of poetry invented, it is said, in late 18th century Delhi and Lucknow, paints a remarkable picture of pre-colonial urban life in early modern North India. The social world of Rekhti poems is populated with workers, vendors, and servants, both male and female, and is characterized by intimacies shared across class, caste, religious, and gender boundaries. There is an expansion in this poetry of the ways in which love and desire can be spoken of and imagined. This love exists between women and women, women and men and men. Among the unconventional relations portrayed in this poetry were those with male and female spirit intimates, jinns and fairies or paris, relations which were an essential part of navigating human relations and intimacies. At Firozshah Kotla today, as in 18th century Rekhti, the Jinn saints of Firozshah Kotla still bless and make possible non-normative intimacies, not only in the wishes that people express in letters written to the Jinn, but in the social practices of the shrine. Within the space, women often talk to unrelated men about their lives of desire, and in the space, located in a city with a terrible reputation for violence against women, women also vigorously debate with men about matters spiritual and theological, and they have no compunctions in telling men that they are wrong or misguided. They crack jokes with men, and within the space, the men treat them as friends, confidants, teachers, as equals and superiors. And desire, expressed by both men and women, and across the boundaries of caste and community, is relatively unproblematic here. For instance, one afternoon when I was sitting here with a bunch of Hindu teenagers, the conversation turned to the hotness of Muslim girls, which, as they pointed out, was amply in evidence at Firozshah Kotla and was one of their prime reasons for coming. In a place like Firozshah Kotla, where Hindus and Muslims, men and women, high caste and low, come together in ways that disrupt the usual boundaries of family and community, the dargah opens up the possibilities of desire and its consummation, of meeting the gazes and bodies of strangers. This too shows remarkable continuities with early 18th century Delhi shrines, as described, for example, by the Deccani traveller Dargah Quli Khan in his Murakka-e-Dehli, but very different from the more policed and often gender-segregated spaces in the more institutionalized Sufi shrines in Delhi, which are much more influenced by relatively recent reformist ideas of pious behavior. Which brings me to the next section of theorizing the city of Jinn. What does it mean to live in a city of Jinns? The Jinn serve as witnesses of times long gone, figures of authority whose shrine blesses remembered forms of urban religious life, forgotten by the amnesia of the post-colonial state, and rendered un-Islamic by the selective amnesia of revivalist traditions. The Jinn remind us of an Islamic city, to revive that old Orientalist trope, constituted not just by bazaar, mosque, and hammam, but also by the antinomial potentials that have long been part of the Islamic tradition. To take a geographically relevant example, on the steps of the Grand Jama Masjid, less than a mile to the northwest of Firozshah Kotla, is the grave of the 17th century Sufi Sarmad Shaheed, martyred by Aurangzeb for apostasy, whose hagiography includes details of his passionate love for the Hindu Abhay Chand. And you can see copies of the book there. The Jinn invite us, in the spirit of Shahab Ahmad's work, to think of other forms of authority and transmission in the constitution of the Islamic tradition beyond the overwhelming focus in both academic and reformist approaches on legalist fiqh. In popular memory, the revival of religious practices at Firozshah Kotla is linked to the figure of Laddu Shah, once known as Naeem, a figure deeply identified with the working class precariat of Old Delhi. At different points in his life, he was a musician, a black marketeer of cinema tickets, and finally, a healer. The story of his healing powers is linked to Firozshah Kotla. People remember him sitting on an elevated spot among these ruins here and playing music which so charmed the Jinn, Jinnat unke aashik ho gaye, that they gave him the gift of healing. It was this gift, they say, that first brought people to Firozshah Kotla. Are jinns real? Their whole point in the tradition, if we are to think with it seriously, is for them to be non-empirically verifiable. To paraphrase the Quran, they can see you from where you cannot see them. Hence, jinn are and always have been invitations to allegory. Jinn have long been tied to the difference and danger of socially marginal Muslims, as Emilio Spadola has noted in Morocco. And jinn have long been tied to the memories of ethnic and cultural difference, which have been submerged in the constitution of normative national selves. In Morocco, the Jinnia Aisha Kandisha is tied to the memory of black Africans and their migrations north. In the Sudan, the jinn who manifest in the Zar trance rituals sometimes speak as colonial officials. To live in a city of jinns is to be acutely aware of subjectivity that is shaped and undone by histories and affects far wider than the individual and his or her lifetime. Every city is a city of jinns, only some of them are aware of this. If we follow the tradition of the jinn in Rekhti poetry, it is to see the human self as not buffered, as Charles Taylor would have us moderns be, but porous to the play of pleasure, of desire that comes at you from outside the subject, shape-shifting and queer like the jinn. To live in a city of jinn is to have a sophisticated set of metaphors to speak of the transmission of affect and its social and subjective consequences long before the recent affective turn in the social sciences. In Delhi, the increased prominence of the jinn in the public life of the city is not just the continuation of tradition, but a profound transformation. The jinn used to be venerated in domestic spaces, in ceremonies held in private gatherings. Now they are public saints claiming space and presence in the reconfigured landscapes of the post-colonial city. This transformation in the nature of the jinn and their claims to sainthood marks a theological newness, which also makes a new ethical claim on the spaces of the city. If the jinn teach us that to live in a city is to be open to difference, to the trauma and the joy of the other, to be open to a density of affect and the density of history, then the growing popularity of the Jinn Dargah in Delhi contains within it the idea of living well in such a city. To live well in a city is to live with difference, not merely with tolerance, but with an open embrace, to make those different from you kin and not strangers. To give just one example, Manohar Lal or Lalaji, one of the Hindu regulars I befriended at Firoz Shah Kotla, always spoke in a sophisticated Persian register when discussing matters theological. He was also someone who, despite his regular visits to Firoz Shah Kotla, had mixed feelings about Muslims. It is in my dreams, Manohar Lal told me, that Babas have taught me the Musalmani Zaban, as he referred to the register of his theological speech. Manohar Lal was born near the 14th century Muslim shrine of Qadam Sharif. His wife's family hails from the Muslim majority parts of Old Delhi. He lives near a mosque in East Delhi and wakes up to the sound of the azan, the call to prayer. He watches Bombay cinema, which has been noted to be a deeply Islamicate art form. We can assume he's heard some Persian and Urdu in theological contexts and otherwise in his waking life. In his dream life, the jinn ennoble this otherness of the speech he's intimate with and make it an unproblematic inheritance of the self. Nameless intimacy. The forms of sociality at Firoz Shah Kotla make kinship extend far beyond family and community. These forms of extended kinship play a vital part in holding open a potentiality of coexistence and friendship in a city long riven by sectarian violence and caste discrimination. One of the striking things I discovered during my fieldwork at Firoz Shah Kotla is what I call an ethic of nameless intimacy. People seldom use given names here to communicate with or identify one another. Names are easy markers of religious and caste identity. The anonymity of everyday interaction at Firoz Shah Kotla allows for the possibilities of a kinship that transcends the usual boundaries of family and community. Here, people's intimacy is premised on them being strangers to one another. One time when we were all sitting around in the lawns at Firoz Shah Kotla, one of the regulars, who was Hindu, said that 75% of people who come to dargahs are Hindus. Everyone nodded their heads in agreement, including the Muslims present. Then he said that the people who go most to dargahs are people from Pehlwan's Qaum, community or caste. Everyone nodded in agreement again. It is reflective of the ethics of nameless intimacy that Pehlwan's Qaum was never explicitly mentioned. Pehlwan, or wrestler, he used to be one in his youth, his given name is known but never used, is from the Balmiki or Valmiki caste. In other words, he is from the Bhangi or sweeper caste, whose traditional work was cleaning the streets and drains and carrying away the shit of the city. This is not something that anyone else at Firoz Shah Kotla ever mentioned to me. Pehlwan told me himself several months into my research after we had become good friends. Today, despite affirmative action and education that has immensely benefited their community, a large number of Balmikis are still employed to clean the sewers of the city and perform other kinds of cleaning jobs still considered to be the lowest class of menial labor. Pehlwan himself has worked at cleaning floors, though in the service of a multinational banking corporation. Pehlwan's caste traditionally stayed outside of the main village settlements in the Delhi hinterland and elsewhere, and weren't allowed to pray in upper caste Hindu temples and even formally egalitarian mosques because they were considered ritually impure. But you wouldn't know this from a regular Thursday of visiting Firozshah Kotla, where you would see Pehlwan as a respected member of our motley congregation of Hindus and Muslims, a man whose friendship and opinion mattered to those who gathered there, and whose feet people sometimes touched to ask for his blessings. Coming towards the end now, and the kind of a final section, is on the ruin and ecological thought. What does it mean to live in a city of Jinn? What does it mean to be intimate with another species of being, one which shapeshifts into animals such as cats and snakes and kites? As Jinn are shapeshifters in the Islamic tradition, often taking the form of animals, this gives animal encounters a particular charge and significance in this space and makes possible a kinship which extends far beyond the human. One time, as I sat chatting in our usual circle at Firozshah Kotla, a large centipede emerged from the grass near my feet. I pointed to it in mild alarm because I was barefoot, and in the fading light, the centipede seemed huge. Everyone else's reaction was entirely different. He is giving us darshan, I was told, the term used for the auspicious sight of a deity. I was congratulated for being lucky enough to see the Baba or saint appear before my eyes. Then the centipede saint disappeared into the earth again. In the subterranean spaces of Firozshah Kotla, people also encounter the saints as snakes and cats. And in contrast to the densely human streets of Old Delhi and working class East Delhi, home to the majority of people who come here, Firozshah Kotla is now a zone of zoological density and diversity in the life of the city. Cats are plentiful here, prospering on the milk offered by devotees. Newcomers to the site often ask if this is where they can find the Billion Ka Mazar, the shrine of the cats. There's an increasing number of dogs who are easier to photograph. There are many colonies of black ants here, prospering on the flour offered outside their burrows and the sweets offered to the saints in subterranean chambers. Pigeons flock to the grain scattered for them every day, and kites gather to feast on the meat thrown to them. In the dark passages and chambers under the mosque, dense clusters of bats hang from the ceilings, chittering and squeaking over the heads of pilgrims as they fly through the crowds of smoke and incense. You can't really see it, but in one of these chambers you can see bats hanging upside down. And this is a relatively well-lit part of the ruins. It's much darker on the other side. Muhammad Swalehin, member of the organizing committee of the masjid at Firozshah Kotla, remembers that when the first namazis would come to offer prayers at Firozshah Kotla in the late 1970s, there would be snakes lying on the steps of the mosque who would slither apart to make room for the congregants. Back then, there were no floodlights on the ring road, which runs just to the east of the mosque, and on winter nights during Ramzan, it would be so dark that people couldn't see their hands in front of their faces when they raised them for worship. In his nostalgic retelling of what Firozshah Kotla used to be like in the good old days, the spiritual charge of the place came from it being a space of the ecological sublime, a space where humans walked among snakes without fear, and where the darkness that enveloped worshippers was primordial and pure, a thing of awe and wonder, unlike the light-polluted nights of contemporary Delhi, where you cannot see the stars. In the gardens of Firozshah Kotla, in its plenitude of animal life, I see a reflection of the vanished sacred landscapes of Delhi, now lost to sewage and concrete. In reading pre-modern Urdu and Persian accounts of Delhi, I was struck by how much the sacredness of the landscape was indexically connected to the ecology, topography, and waterscape of the city, to greenery, flowing water, and the scent of flowers. In the long-established dargahs of Delhi, such as Dargah Nizamuddin, Chirag-e Delhi, and Qutb Sahib, the distance between the local ecology and the human experience of these dargahs has grown exponentially in the last few decades with the massive growth of post-colonial Delhi. In Intezar Hussein's evocative prose, translated by Professor Jamil, the coming together of the tall grass of the monsoon and the call of the peacock with the words of the poet Amir Khusro at the Dargah of Nizamuddin in the early 1950s is replaced 30 years later by concrete, marble, and a landscape all too human, shoulder scraping against shoulder. Khoye se khoa chilta hai, to use one of Intezar Saab's much used metaphors. The very nature of religious life in Delhi, its profound connection to life, animal and vegetal, has been profoundly altered in Delhi over the last few decades, and this has passed almost completely unnoticed in the scholarly literature on the city and its religions. One of the most surprising aspects of my fieldwork was how frequently the working class populace that came to Firozshah Kotla from some of the most densely human parts of the city referred to animal lore in their conversations. Their familial history was rooted in the urban. Their families had belonged to Old Delhi for at least 3 or 4 generations, but they knew the names and kinds of the grasses that grew in the lawns of Firozshah Kotla, which of those were good for buffaloes to eat, and what kinds of parrots nested in which trees, to summarize just one conversation. They remember a city that the state and the city's elites have forgotten, a city whose communal life extended far beyond the human. And as the number of people coming to the shrine increases every year, so has the number of animals. In September and October 2014, when I returned after a 3-year absence, there were many more dogs and a population of kites that now ran into the hundreds. The dramatic increase in the number of kites was directly linked to a new ritual that had come to Firozshah Kotla since my last visit, that of flinging raw meat skyward. It was a thrilling sight to see tens of kites swoop and dive at close quarters to get at the pieces of meat flung upward by humans standing in a ruined courtyard below the steps of the mosque, and then sail out of the melee, meat triumphantly caught in their claws. When I asked why people were flinging meat to the kites, I got 2 kinds of answers. One was that these were God's creation, makhluk, and it was a religious duty and an obligation to feed all of God's creatures. The other answer was that this was Jaan ka sadqa, the charity or the donation or the offering of life. When one had when one had severe problems and difficulties, pareshaniyan, ke jaan pe aake ban baithi thi, when one's life itself was in question, one touched the meat in a bag, prayed over it, and then flung it to the birds. By consuming the meat, the kites also consumed their troubles. One man told me that after throwing the meat to the kites, to the birds, sab halka ho jata hai. Everything becomes lighter, and you can see the kites flying over Firozshah Kotla. Rather than thinking of this as sympathetic magic, what if we thought of this as sympathy, the establishment of common feeling, and hence of kinship? For in Urdu and Persian, a close companion is called a ghamkhwar, one who eats your sorrow. At Firozshah Kotla, the birds are now ghamkhwar for the humans who feed them, the companions who consume their sorrows. In contrast to the ASI's conservation paradigm of taking care only of dead buildings, another vision of conservation has been growing in the city in recent years. Ratish Nanda is a conservation architect who has been involved in heritage conservation in Delhi for over 2 decades and is currently projects director for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, India. Ratish has been involved in the restoration of Humayun's tomb, and his ambition is to transform the area stretching north of Humayun's tomb, dotted with medieval buildings, into the biggest urban open space in the world, in his words, bigger than Central Park. And this is slowly happening. When I asked him if he saw this as somehow reviving the old sense of Delhi as a sacred landscape, he replied, "We are more keen to revive bird habitats and things like that." This was back in 2011. In recent years, as the plans to make this park, now called the Deenpana Archaeological Park, have come closer to fruition, Ratish's Facebook timeline is increasingly filled with pictures of birds, many species of which flock to the renewed gardens around the ruins. I've documented 78 bird species sitting right here. Once we are done, there will be 150 bird species. We are trying to get every kind of protection from wildlife to heritage for the archaeological park. When I talked to Ratish about the birds on his timeline in August 2016, in his office just to the north of Humayun's tomb, he said that he started photographing the birds as a form of relief from the pressures of conservation work. They keep me sane. That comment stuck with me. When he first spoke about bird habitats, he spoke as a manager husbanding the landscapes and creatures at his command. It is only years later, in an unrecorded conversation with an ethnographer he'd known for almost a decade, that he could acknowledge that it was not just him creating habitats for the birds, but that the birds were also making the city more habitable for him. Humans become, to cite Anand Singh in the context of Matsutake mushrooms, only one of many participants in making livability. Those who come to Firoz Shah Kotla in their myriad encounters with jinns as snakes, cats, and birds have known this all along. What does it mean to live in a city of jinns? It means to start giving a language to the impulse that connects not just popular religion at Firoz Shah Kotla or contemporary conservation practices at Humayun's tomb, but also people's love for the hawks of Central Park in New York or the cats of Istanbul. It is to think with the emergent sensibility that sees the life of cities as more than human. It is significant that this sensibility is taking on a new public life in the city across the usual boundaries of religion and secular, at a time when the ecological devastation of Delhi is finally becoming an issue of concern in the public life of the city. Think of the huge furor over the cutting of trees recently. This emergent sensibility decenters the anthropocentrism that is in no small measure has got us to the age of planetary instability that we now know as the Anthropocene. Rather, it points us towards what Donna Haraway calls the Chthulucene, both an era to come and a theoretical position not of human dominance, but of attentiveness to the dense interconnections with more than human lives. Haraway sees an ethical imperative in the forming of non-normative, non-reproductive, multi-species kinship, make kin not babies in her memorable formulation, because only that can give us a true picture of our entanglements with and responsibilities towards the more than human world. The growing importance of connecting to birds and animals in both ritual practice at Firoz Shah Kotla and conservation at Humayun's tomb point us towards similar potentials. They open up the affective and intellectual possibilities of connecting to the world not as errant and concerned managers of the world we have transcended, but as animals once again in kinship with our fellow creatures, with the snakes and bats that make space for us to walk among them. Thank you. Sorry.